hits to some obscurities, and in addition to looking back, we'll look ahead and talk to him about what's coming up in the future. Cliff joins us by phone from New York City, where he is attending the U.S. Open tennis tournament. We are so delighted to have the opportunity to speak with Sir Cliff Richard. Sir Cliff, welcome, and thank you for joining us here on Wired for Sound Radio.
Thank you. I'm so thrilled to be on my own radio station.
Well, before we ask you some questions about your history, I first wanted to ask you about the future. You recently posted a video on your Facebook page in which you mentioned that you were planning to record an album of what you called classic rock and roll.
Yes,
anything more you can tell us about that?
He was an unbelievable rock and roll fan. He's a wealthy man, and he wanted to produce it. I'm thinking, I said to him, do you realize it costs quite a bit of money to make these things? He said, I want my name on a rock and roll album. And he said, I think you're one of our first original rock and roll singers, and I'd like it to be you. So I said, fine. So I'm going to go to Nashville in either April or May next year, and get with some friends there and try and record the way we used to in those early days. Get in there and do it relatively live. In other words, I'll sing it with the band, but I'll concentrate on what they're doing, and then when we finish with them, I'll put my voice on again so that I can do it more correctly, so to speak, and maybe even get different feels from what they do. But and it's going to be stuff that's really classic Elvis, Little Richard, Buddy Holly, Ricky Nelson stuff. Just try to pick out all those unbelievable songs. America is the fatherland of rock and roll, and everywhere else in the world we cut our teeth on rock and roll because of the artists that came from here. And I just thought, well, I've been probably going longer than most, and I feel I've earned my right to have a go at some of these wonderful, classic, iconic songs.
Do you think, will there be songs that you've never recorded before?
There'll be many that I won't have recorded before. Okay. I'm going to try. I must do at least one or two Elvis songs. And I've already thought I'd love to do a version of Too Much. And I've never recorded that. I've done live versions which have been recorded of some of Elvis' songs, like All Shook Up. Mm-hmm. And so there has been recordings of them, but never from a studio point of view. But I'm going to try and pick out songs I've not recorded before, and try to. You have to pay respects to the original. So we'll probably do them in a similar way. But the modern the technology is so great now, it won't sound the same. Hopefully we'll make it sound bigger and brighter, but there was a magic about that old stuff, and it's no good trying to compete with it. You just have to do something that's now and hope that people will enjoy it as much.
And one of the things I sense, and please tell me if I'm correct, is that you kind of, for many years, have had this reputation maybe as like a pop rather than a rock and roll artist. You kind of do kind of big productions in your concerts and things like that. But at heart, you still really like the good old rock and roll, don't you?
Yeah, I do. I mean, if I do anything like a small event, like a charity or something, I tend to just take my guitar and thrash through, the Buddy Holly songs of Ricky Nelson, Everly Brothers, Elvis, some of my early stuff that's pretty basic. I mean, either way, I have to do that. If I'm going on my own, I'm going to be limited. It's very hard to sing on an acoustic guitar, double woman. Well, hard for me anyway. We don't talk anymore. They're all so electronic in their approach that I don't even make an attempt to do those. But yes, I've always been basically mind you, I've always thought of rock and roll was much more poppy than it is now, but rock pop has melodic influences, along with a certain amount of drum and bass aggression. That's when you listen to songs like Teddy Bear or Shook Up and stuff like that, they were obviously basically rock and roll, but what made them rock and roll were the drums and the bass. And the melodies were very poppy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, speaking of rock and roll, I want to ask you how you feel about your legacy, or whether you really care about that. I mean, is it important to you that you be recognized as, basically the pioneer, you and the Shadows, of rock and roll in Britain?
Well, while I'm still alive, of course, I do wish sometimes they'd actually pay more attention to the fact that the Shadows and I and a couple of other guys in Britain, Marty Wilde and Billy Fury, we were 5 years ahead of the Beatles, but the same age as the Beatles. So, and I was I've said this before, I feel we played a part in the Beatles' careers, because I remember reading that Paul or John said something like, Cliff and the Shadows had it sewn up in Britain, so we left to go to Hamburg. So I always say to the journalists, in a way, we kind of kicked him out of the country, but they went and found something fantastic, brought it back, and gave us all a kick in the teeth, and then took rock and roll back to America. So, but we played a part in that. So I feel sometimes we are overlooked as being the pioneers of rock and roll in Britain, and I'm just so grateful that John Lennon at one point said that before Cliff Richard's Move It, there wasn't anything. I mean, not in America, because he knew darn well that everything had happened here. But before I made my first record, Move It, he believed that there hadn't been any rock and roll before that outside America. So I was really thrilled to have that in my armament of comments when people try to write us off. But, you know, I guess the history books will have to show it, that we did come first. And it doesn't really matter. I don't know whether it really matters. Rock and roll is such a wonderful art form. It no longer belongs to a younger generation. When we started, my parents and aunts and uncles did not like rock and roll. They were into jazz and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And we weren't. But now, when you think about it, most of us go and buy the records that are in the charts. Even now, today, I may not be a fan of everything that I hear, but that was never the case. None of us like everybody. So, yes, I just wish that they would sometimes honor us by saying, well, at least saying that we were the first.
Yeah. Well, I've kind of, through the radio station and through our website and things like that, tried to at least make a small effort to raise awareness that Cliff Richard and the Shadows should be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Well, I promise you, I'm really grateful, and I can speak on behalf of the Shadows, who not only had a career with me, but I kicked them off with their first instrumental hit, and they had many, many hits. And very often we would swap places. You know, I would have a number one. In fact, I can remember having a number one with a song called Please Don't Tease. And the instrumental that knocked me off was Apache by the Shadows. So, you know, there was no animosity there. We were a team, and we wanted both of us to be successful, and we were.
One of the things that we try to do on our station and in some of the one-hour programs that we produced last year was to showcase some kind of largely unknown or under-recognized facets of your career. And one of those things was your songwriting. You said in the past that you don't consider yourself a songwriter, but you know, and while I guess you can't be called a prolific writer, you've written you know, a fair number of very good songs. So can you tell us a little bit about the times when you have written?
Well, the funny thing is, at the very beginning of my career with the Shadows, we used to write together. So you'll find quite a lot of songs where I co-wrote Bruce Welch or Hank Marvin, or we did it all together. And then what happened was, very, very quickly, within about 18 months of my career getting started, it was obvious that we had really caught the imagination of journalists and the public, and quite wrongly, I was being hailed as the answer to Elvis. And I've always said there is no answer to Elvis. He was the first, the one and only, and there is no answer. He will be always out there on his own. But nevertheless, I was pinned. That name was pinned on me. The answer, English answer to Elvis, and I quite liked the fact that when we went on tour, the press would want to have a press conference, and the Shadows would say to me, "Look, you're the answer to Elvis. You're the star. You go and talk to them." So I go there and have my photograph taken, and I was on the front pages of newspapers, and I loved it. But of course, by the time I came back from the press conference, the Shadows had written 3 or 4 songs, and I wasn't one of the writers. They gave them to me, so I got the benefit of their gifted writing. And then I discovered that even though I did continue to write, occasionally I did write, sometimes by myself, sometimes I worked with, there's a couple of keyboard players that I worked with, and they used to put down a piano track, and I would write a melody and a lyric over that, and we would do it that way. And so it's just one of those things, but in the end, I felt that I was much more, becoming much more of a performer, like an actor presents other people's scripts.
Right.
I was very happy to actually perform and present the drama, as in the case of Devil Woman, of somebody else's song,
right.
and giving it interpretation that maybe the writer didn't think about. So I'm very contented with the way my career went. Yeah, I sometimes look back and wish that I'd been encouraged to write more. But, you know, how can I grumble? I mean, I've had a career that's lasted such a long time. You know, we were written off as one-hit wonders in those days. Here today and gone tomorrow is another phrase I remember.
And 53 years.
We proved them all wrong, yeah. And of course nobody, not even us, we didn't know that rock and roll was here to stay. You know, we sang rock and roll was here to stay, but we didn't really know that it was going to be here for this long. But it won its way through because it is a genuinely fantastic, wide art form. You know, you can do everything from country ballads to Led Zeppelin. And in between all of that, those extremes, you've got this wonderful umbrella of stuff called pop rock. And no matter whether you call it house music, garage music, rock and roll, pop rock, heavy metal, for me, it is basically rock and roll.
Well, I think, I did want to ask you, like on songs like Bachelor Boy and Don't Talk to Him and On the Beach, were you kind of like primarily writing lyrics for those things, or?
A bit of both. On the Beach, I help write melody. Bachelor Boy was lyric. There's not much of it. There's not too many. There's not it's a very simple verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus. And Bruce had written the verse and the chorus, and between us we wrote the other verses and chorus, other verses. Don't Talk to Him was also definitely. He came along to me one night. We were up in Blackpool in the north of England doing a show, and when we were over, we said, "I've had this thing in my head." So I said, well, let's hum it. You hum it through, and we put it onto a little tape. And I took it back to the digs where I was staying. And the next day I sang him the lyrics I'd written. And he went, oh, fantastic. So we recorded it. So, yeah, I've written quite a few lyrics. And quite often, in a couple of cases, I was sent a melody that had a lyric that had no melody. So I used to get my guitar out and then read the lyric, but I liked the lyrics, so I just tried and wrote 2 or 3 songs like that. There's no rules. That's what I love about Our Outfit. There are no rules, and there's no rules at all. And I nearly worked with a wonderful singer called Dame Kiri Tikanova. She was really a fantastic opera singer, beautiful soprano. And there was talk about us working, but unfortunately her relationship with her husband fell apart, and then everything fell apart, and then we never did do it. But while we were planning it, she said, oh, you guys are so lucky because you can sing these songs in different keys. You can change the phrasing of it. She said, we have to do things the way they were written 400 years ago. And I suddenly thought how lucky we are that we don't have those restraints. We can just pick up a song that was sung by Elvis and still sound like the same song, but we would maybe phrase it differently. Can you imagine what Mariah Carey could do with Teddy Bear? It would be fantastic, and there's no reason why she shouldn't. So I'm more and more grateful that I'm in our rock and roll world rather than somewhere else, because it's left me free to do everything from country to. I even got one record played on the BBC on a heavy metal station program. It's called Thief in the Night. And it was heavy. Yeah. So I've done everything really when you think about it. But you find your niche. I suppose really I'm best at doing the Devil Woman, We Don't Talk Anymore, Dreaming, or Little Love. It's definitely pop, but it's definitely rock and roll.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We are speaking with Sir Cliff Richard here on Wired for Sound Radio. And another thing that stands out to me on many of your records, going back to, I guess, the 80s, is the background vocals. And in many cases, the background voices are all you.
Well, I've always been I learned how to sing harmonies by listening to the Everly Brothers, because Phil and Don would always sing. One on one would be singing the melody, and the other one would be a third above. Singing that first harmony that's above the melody. And what I used to do sometimes was go a third below and make it a 3-part that way, or sometimes I'd go into falsetto and sing above Phil and make it a 3-part that way. So I learned about harmonies through them, really. And then I found that I enjoyed that section. That part of recording was so creative for me. You get a song sent to you, and then you think, well, how can we do the backing vocals? Well, quite often you could do contrapuntal things with lyrics. You just mix some of the lyrics of the song with a little extra or something else to it. And what I did was I used to multi-track my voice, but then I always, or most of the time, got my friends who did backing vocals for me on stage to come in and do everything that I did, but with their texture of voices. So it didn't sound too incestuous. Their voices added another dimension that made it stop being all, because sometimes you're almost too close.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the first times I really noticed that on one of your was on Van Morrison's record of Whenever God Shines His Light, and I noticed there was some cool background vocals that you did, and I was assuming you came up with that, and I was just wondering if you kind of enjoyed doing that kind of thing.
I did, and he was quite easy to work with, really, although he turned up 2 hours late. I said to the engineer, look, I don't have unlimited time today, so let me do he knew where I was supposed to be singing, so he then started the tape with the red light on, and I sang what I felt I should do, and then I said to him, look, I've got some ideas for backing vocals, and we'll start work on those, I'll do those, and then when he comes in, when Van comes in, he can listen and then say, oh, I don't like that, or whatever, and there was one line that he wanted me to change, and it was one line that he wanted me to sing in unison with him exactly as he did it, which was the most difficult part, because he's the most unusual way of sometimes presenting a piece of phrasing. But that took me the longest time to do, but not that long, but it was the most difficult part. But otherwise, he was very happy with the backing thing, as I'd suggested, so he turned out to be a very, very, very easy person to work with.
Yeah. I want to ask you about your success, or what some people kind of overstate as lack of success in the U.S. I actually had the opportunity to view some documents from Capitol Records. I was doing some research, not on you, but actually on the Beach Boys. But I saw some Capitol Records reports about sales of singles, and I saw the sales of your single "Move It" in 1958 here in the U.S., and the actual sales were 1,104 copies.
I know. Well, you know, the funny thing, I've never put my finger on why it didn't happen for me here, other than we were just too early, I think. You know, when you think 5 years later the Beatles came and absolutely took the world and America by storm. But by that stage, at that time, of course, Elvis and the others had all been singing for almost 10 years. I had been singing for 5 years in Britain, but when I went there early on, you had your Fabians and your Frankie Avalons and Elvis and Ricky Nelson and Buddy Holly, Eddie Cochran. It was amazing. We did come and do, the Shadows and I came and joined a show called The Biggest Show of Stars for 1960. And we were with the Clovers, the Crests, Frankie Avalon, who are the guys that originally did Twist and Shout?
The Isley Brothers.
The Isley Brothers were on the show.
Yeah.
So Bobby Rydell, Clyde McPhatter.
Yeah.
And we came and we joined the show, and 3 of us stopped the show every night. 3 of us. Clyde McPhatter, Bobby Rydell, and me. And it was fantastic. The people couldn't follow us. Whoever came after us had a real tough time getting on. And I thought naively to myself, that's it, I've done it. You know, it took a long while for me to realize that if you're doing 20 shows in the States, you know, if you're in Houston, Texas, and you're storming the stage there, no one can follow you, they don't even know that's happened in Dallas.
Yeah.
It just doesn't. So it was very difficult for me. I think for that reason, you had so many great stuff and so many good things happening here. I don't think people were too excited about bothering with some Englishman that came over that had made a record called Move It. You know, they just were not bothered by it. But of course, you know, you do need the machine. And I discovered years and years later that someone at EMI had said, we're not excited by Cliff Richard material. And I'm thinking, it's so unfair, because I have had 9 top 30 hits over here. And 2 of them were million sellers. We Don't Talk Anymore, Devil Woman. Dreaming was a success. I did a duet with Olivia Newton-John.
Sure.
Daddy's Home came into the top 30. Living Doll was in the top 30. I know that you don't really sell too much before you get into that 30 mark, but it seemed funny to me that a record company would feel that way, when really, if you were a company selling bad glass and people were buying it, you would make more and more of it and sell it. And I couldn't figure out why someone thought I was not exciting, that they didn't see the potential of sales when in fact there were sales, and all they needed to do was capitalize on it. But anyway, I've given up. I never got bitter, fortunately. I think my life is, I'm so happy with my life and where and who and what I am. Perhaps I wouldn't have reached that condition in my life if I'd been bitter about something like that. I just was having such a great time everywhere else in the world. And my then manager, who died some years back, Peter Gormley, is Australian, who discovered Olivia Newton-John as well. He'd said to me, okay, supposing you make it in the States, tell me, which territories are you going to give up? And I said, what do you mean? He said, look, if you make it in the States, America will demand a lot of time from you. You will have to go there and spend lots of time there, do all the thousands of radio stations and TV. And I thought, oh, and although I didn't feel grateful that I didn't make it, it made sense to me that I should maybe concentrate on where I have made it. And that's what I did, really. And I in a way, it's possibly my fault as much as anybody else's that I didn't come over and just live here for 3 or 4 years. And Elton John did it. Elton was here for quite a while before he actually broke ground. And maybe I should have done that. So I can't just blame everybody else. It's partly my fault. And also, there's also the truth of the matter that this could well be true. It may be that what I do doesn't necessarily appeal to the American audience all the time. Yeah, once or twice I did it. And that's also possibly true.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the 80s records, I mean, maybe to think that you could have been as big in America, that could be true about, but it is very puzzling that, you know, the momentum you had in the early 80s didn't sustain itself, because you had like that 18-month period where you had 5 big radio hits here, you know. And,
well, I mean, I guess it really had started later than the Beatles. I mean, the thing is, I think the Beatles started this huge invasion of, first of all, English, you know, the English invasion, the Liverpool sound and all that. Everyone's so absorbed with that. In fact, there was a period in England, in fact, about a year or 18 months, when the Shadows and I got no press coverage at all. And we were getting really scared and wondering about what's going to happen. Everybody was talking about the Beatles in the States, and they didn't seem to print pictures of us or write any stories about us. And again, my very wise manager, Peter Gormley, said, are you still selling records? I went, yeah. Are they number one? I said, yeah. He said, are you selling out your concerts? So all of us chimed in, yeah. He said, well, what the hell are you worried about? You know, somebody's having a really good time. Let them have their good time. And so it was fantastic, man. I feel so well influenced by people like that who have entered my career and my life, and it was fantastic. Again, he helped us to deal with all of that. You can imagine that all of us, everybody was probably terrified of what happened with the Beatles, because they stormed away in the way that 10 years before, or maybe 9 years before, Elvis had done that. Elvis was a stab wound for every jazz singer that ever existed. When he came in, it was all jazz before that. And, you know, pop ballads, and not even pop ballads, but you know what I mean. And
standards and
of
things
course,
like that, yeah.
Yeah, the big standards and the American songbook stuff, which of course, you know, now I'm thinking how wonderful all that stuff is. But at the time, rock and roll came in and pushed it all aside, and it must have been painful for the artists to perform that genre of music. So in the same way, we were all suffering a little bit by the attention that the Beatles got. And then of course, it did level off. And then suddenly, of course, you know, a couple of years later, everything was back to normal, and we were in competition with them and with lots of other people. And they had to deal with an onslaught of other people that came along. It's a shame that I think they made records for about 9 years, didn't they? So
yeah, that's about right. 62 through 1970, that's about it.
Yeah. So 9 years, and they obviously had the gift to be able to go on doing it for a lot longer. But, you know, with bands, I think it's more difficult. When you're a solo artist, you can change your mind and do things, be adventurous in some way, find it fails, come back to something else that you know is going to work. With a band, if you've got 4 members, then, you know, they might have their own ideas as to how a song should be. Well, in the case of John and Paul, I mean, they wrote together, but I've heard that many times, sometimes they agreed that everything they wrote would be Lennon and McCartney.
Yes.
So Paul may have written the whole song, but it would be Lennon and McCartney credited. So I can see that it probably was much more difficult for them to actually stay together as a unit, as it was for the Shadows. The Shadows, way before the Beatles broke up, they'd gone, and because they each had definite views as to what they should be doing, and they couldn't do it together. So again, it's an interesting thing, our industry. It brings us these wonderful, wonderful people, and then somehow or another just allows them to fall apart. Although, of course, Paul had success by himself, yes. George Harrison had success by himself, and John Lennon, but never the same success as they had when they were the Beatles.
And in your case, after the Shadows broke up, you managed to have this incredible run of musicians who joined your band in the early 70s. I mean, it's pretty amazing that your band at one point included Terry Britton and Alan Tarney and Trevor Spencer and even like John Farah for a while. So yes. You managed to attract these great musicians to be part of your band.
I did, and of course all the people you mentioned came from Australia. And there's always been an affinity between us and Britain and Australia. You'll always find a mass of Australians traveling through Europe. They're a very, very adventurous group of people. But of course, because I had been there so many times and been a big success in Australia, all those guys had known of me. And when they came, the one thing about Australia, this is lucky for the rest of us and the rest of the world, is that for them to really make it, Olivia couldn't possibly make it the way she made it just by staying in Australia. It's a very small audience. I think there's probably now, there used to be about 11 or 12 million, it must be about 20 million people in Australia now, maybe a little bit more. So it's a little bit easier to have a career there, I suppose. But to really make it big, they have to take a stepping stone, and Britain was the stepping stone. And they came over, I offered them jobs to be in my band, they were happy to do it. It was obvious to me that Terry Britten was never going to be my guitarist forever. It was obvious to me that Alan Tiney was going to be a great producer. And so I lost them slowly, but I didn't. They stayed in touch. They wrote songs for me. Terry wrote Devil Woman, and Alan Tiney wrote We Don't Talk Anymore, and a bunch of other things they both wrote. And in fact, funny enough, the one song I missed out on, Terry Britten sent a demo to my office, and it was sent back saying, we don't think this is right for Cliff. And it turned out to be Tina Turner's hit, What's Love Got to Do with It? So I missed out on that.